You're welcome. Thanks for joining me in the breakout room. What are we? We're breakout room Clackamas, right? Aren't we Clackamas? I think we are. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, if you all don't mind, if you'll forgive me here. So you all should be able to see my screen. I'm just going to make it so that I can see all of your beautiful faces. Welcome back. I think we're trying to keep these breakout rooms as much as we can similar to the groups that we had last time, so we can start to create those. So if you all can see my screen, maybe I can get back to seeing my screen. We are Team Clackamas. So I read the listening and learning themes to you, so I don't need to do that. But I'm going to put in the chat for those of you that want to work in Miro directly to do your own kind of gallery walk in our chat. Navigate two screens here. It's not wanting me to do that. Okay. So in the chat, we have the Miro, but I'm going to share and just take you to these quotes. I'm going to start here, and I'll just give you all a moment to read these, and then we'll move kind of from them fairly quickly, so that way we have the most time possible to chat with one another. Okay.
I'm sorry, Karina, we're reading the supporting quotes. Is that what we're reading right now? I ran to the restroom.
Yeah, we are. Sorry, Sandra, we are. We're reading the supporting quotes. So you can either read them. They're the same as the ones that were handed out or emailed out, but I'm just taking a slow gallery walk through them on my screen. Some of these are significantly longer than others. Couple more here. And officially the last one. All right, so with that, what we're going to do is we're just going to try and really kind of focus on this question that we're being asked, right? How should the information presented, everything that you've heard tonight, impact the development of the scenarios? What do you want to tell PPS as they start to create these scenarios? in terms of how what you've heard should impact what they develop and bring back to you all. Who wants to talk to us about that? Yeah, Chris.
I have a yes and answer to that question. I guess, yes, we should certainly pay attention to this data. We're asking, I mean, this is how we said we wanted to come to our decision, is by asking our families, in particular, our families of color. So I'm saying, yes, we need to pay attention, close attention to these things. But my and is, in the set of quotes you just showed us, there was no one from Lane. There was no one from, and when I looked at the raw data, and I haven't looked at it exhaustively, but there were many fewer comments from Lane, Whitman, and Woodmere than there were from the other schools that we're talking to. And
that is 100% true. We
okay,
got
and so
almost no participation from anyone from Lane. We got
yes, right. And so I just feel like I don't know, we just got to try harder. Otherwise, no matter what, in who they are, we're still just listening to the loudest voices if that whole group of people aren't being heard. That's my thought.
Okay. Anybody else? There's some other concerns, some other thoughts. Or what are other ways? How do you think that this should impact the discussions happening in the district about these scenarios?
I don't know. I don't feel like I have a solution for this, but I do kind of echo what Chris is saying. I've thought about this a lot, about how to divide time or how to divvy up the way that we present information, as far as quotes, as far as input from our BIPOC families versus, neighborhood programs versus DLI programs, because a lot of the feedback I've gotten from the people that have participated through our LEDA, and even talking to families and teachers not in the DLI program at Woodstock, because I was approached by a group of teachers and families from Woodstock, who also feel like they're not being heard in their own school. I think that there has been a problem where we're hearing from the same people or the same community of people over and over, and that is further impacting the concern that I see from our BIPOC families, that they already have a distrust of the system, and that when they've come to things, and not just the family that approached me from Arleta recently saying, hey, we went to the listening session, felt like we couldn't say a single thing. They said that one of the people who was speaking that kind of I'm sorry, I'll try to speak more articulately here, who was kind of representing the main thought that was going on, that was being presented by the main group of commenters at that point, said something to the effect of, everyone agrees, and if you don't agree, speak up now. And she said, I felt like I could not absolutely at all speak, that there was this group that had a very dominant voice. And so I conveyed in the chat to the facilitator, I don't feel like I can talk right now, but I don't agree. And so I've heard that from these Woodstock families, from our Arleta families, really disturbing to hear from our BIPOC families, because, as I told them, you guys are people that we have been shouting, we want you involved. And so, there's already a distrust of the system. And so how do we approach gathering this information and having open forums where the forum feels like an equal playing field for people to be heard?
Yeah, I will tell you that was one of the biggest challenges that we had, right? Every session that we had was only open to BIPOC families, but we did see a high preponderance of BIPOC families from Harrison Park in comparison to BIPOC families from Lane or from Woodstock or from other schools, right? That is, I'm gonna attribute that to Leah and her team and getting the distribution out, right? And getting folks to that group, but or to those meetings. And you know, like I said, I would have loved to have 500 voices represented from all across the district. I think that the same amount of effort actually happened at all the schools. So yeah, I think that, so let's, yes, and so to get back to what you were saying, Chris, right? Yes, we recognize that we have to have that we have to create opportunities at all levels of this process to be sure that we are foregrounding the voices of all of the impacted schools and the people most impacted at those schools in this process. But let's process the data we did get, because I don't want to devalue the input that we did get, right? So let's talk about that. How should that influence our decision? So maybe then, Chris, go to the second part of your, because I don't know if did you ever get there for kind of then how do we process what we heard to try and talk about the impact it might have?
So I'm just going to say that some of the things we heard were contradictory. So some people, so where there are contradictions, we're just going to have to use wisdom and there we're not. I hope we, oh my gosh, this is so hard. This is like what I don't do well. Disappointing other people. We are going to disappoint some people. Man, that's tough to do. So where there is contradiction, we're just going to have to do our best work and walk forward with humility and sadness, knowing that we will not have been able to satisfy everyone. And I think the discussion we just heard before we broke into the groups is an example of that. There's still some people who just don't want to lose to K-8. And I wanted to jump up and say, hey, but it wasn't equally available to all people in our district. It's really hard for me to hear that, because kids at Whitman didn't have any option for K-8. If it's so wonderful and it wasn't available to everybody, I just don't think we can call ourselves equitable and yet, continue that system. So there will be disappointments.
I guess I want to add to that, because I think that's what stood out to me too, is I think there were some common themes, but I did see a lot of areas where some of the needs of different communities were in contrast. And then also this fear of like distrust in the process. Like I continue to show up and I continue to not get my needs met, and I continued and so like going kind of a step further when we see contradictions and we know that there's no way we can fulfill all of those, how do we then not perpetuate distrust in certain communities where we can't reach that decision? And so I think that's what makes it hard to move forward. I think there are some things, but I think there is a lot of contradictions and different interests and needs, and knowing that there's no way to do that all is just going to further perpetuate distrust in the system and the process. And how do we, circle back to those communities where we are not going to be able to be responsive or meet all the needs? So I think that was something that I agree I saw too and was concerned about. Like, how do we know there's a lot of competing interests and needs and desires, knowing that there's no way to meet them all? And that is going to just create a lot more distrust, which they were talking about a lot as well.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, to build on that, I agree with what everyone has said. And I think that one of the takeaways is, no matter how much input we get, there is no way to avoid the hard work of filtering that input through whatever values we have set and priorities we have set for this process, right? Like, the answer is not going to be as simple as tabulating the number of times a certain theme comes up and that therefore must be the right answer, right? Because there may be times where the most common answer to a question is in direct contradiction to one of the values or priorities that we've set for this process. Like, and a good example that probably is true across all communities is, like, I remember in phase 1, I think we asked a question on a survey that was like, what are your most important priorities for this process? And the number one answer was like, I don't want anything to change. Well, okay. You know what I mean? Like, that's, we
Right.
could do that, but then we wouldn't be meeting the goals of this process, right? So I think we're gonna have to, I think it's important that we're transparent about, you know, when we see these themes show up, we need to be able to go back to communities and say, here's how all this fed into these scenarios that we come up with, and here's why we took certain feedback, and here's why we didn't take certain, we're allowed to disagree, right? But we need to have an explanation for how that squares with sort of the big picture values or, you know, goals that we're shooting for. So I don't know if I added anything useful to what others have said, but I think the contradiction we're naming is an important one. And I think we need to be able to eventually articulate how we resolve that, like as a coalition, right? Like we need to be clear on how the scenarios reflect that balancing act.
Can I add a quick thing too? I think we need to acknowledge and honor the fact that our data is very limited, and to accept the limitations of this data. I'm looking at data from 202 people spread across 9 schools. And most of these schools aren't even the schools that are our focus. And when I've had parents ask me, well, why didn't I get a call? Why didn't I get a call? It's like, well, our school's not even on this list. So I think we need to acknowledge the limitations of that data and take it as a guiding point, but understand that even within these 9 schools, we can't capture the full picture of Southeast Portland schools. We can tell I have a head cold. 9, it's 7. Sorry, folks. I apologize.
Okay. Anybody else? Let's see. Have we heard from you, Michelle?
Elizabeth has her hand up, I think, right?
Oh, sorry, Elizabeth. Go ahead. I haven't heard from you.
Well, first I was going to say, if there are parents that have like students of color or feel like they represent the BIPOC community, I'd like to hear from them first, and then I do have a comment if we have time, but the first one's I think more important.
Is there anyone in this group that has children in the impacted area that are BIPOC?
Are you talking about in this specific breakout group, or
Yes, I think what Elizabeth was trying to do was foreground the voices of those with BIPOC experiences in this group.
Okay.
And I think the reason that we haven't been able to do that, Elizabeth, in previous sessions, is because we don't have that.
I mean, my kids are Mexican American, but I've already talked enough, so.
So I'm going to jump in if no one else wants to talk. So I've always felt like the purpose of this activity last year and this year is to, in my super simple brain, improve the educational outcomes for Black and Brown students, because they are the ones that are doing the least well according to PPS numbers. And what I think the challenge is we are engaged in a predominantly physical activity of changing distribution of students in the district to achieve academic change outcomes. And this data is really highly qualitative and experiential and values-based, right? So we're trying to apply highly qualitative data to a physical structure activity. And I think it can be done. So what I would like to see is, because I think that educators who are smarter than I, lots of them out there, could help me understand the bright line between the outcomes and the decisions and the recommendations and the goals and experiences that people are asking for. So if I can see scenarios and I can understand how the scenarios deliver better experiences and outcomes, then that will make me really excited about supporting them.
Yeah, that is a very good point, Elizabeth. Thank you. Except I can't sign. Anybody else? Uh-oh. No.
I just echo that, and I think that's one thing that was missing when we got to the point of starting to share scenarios publicly in the in phase one, which was being able to share before you get into the details. Here's what we were trying to accomplish with this option. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like being able to give
Very
that
much so.
narrative really quickly and
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we talked about, I mean, just in terms of trying to, again, do some of this breaking down of the distrust is before we present any option, we are talking about why we developed that option, right? And how we think it best addresses the values. Okay, we are all back. I'll get my participants back. Okay, I'm going to share screen again. Welcome back, y'all. The good news is it feels as though other folks were struggling with the same issues that we were struggling with. So we were not alone. Had a bit of a private chat with Judy and said, I don't envy you one little bit. This is some of the hardest work a school district undertakes. So I believe you all are seeing my Miro board. Is that right? You guys see? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to take us back to Clackamas, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger because I can't make it bigger. So I'm just going to zoom in. What does this data tell you, or what do you see when we think through this? What enrollment issues are you seeing at your kids?
Well, I'll speak real quick. So one thing that we saw at the beginning of the year is, or as we went into late August when school was starting, or midsummer, our first grade numbers were really low. And we made decisions based on that information in terms of how many teachers we had. And then as the days have gone on, we have added more and more first graders. And I think we were seeing that rebound of families that didn't have kids in kindergarten that kind of waited to see what the year would look like, waited to see if we'd be going back into online learning. And we had this huge influx of first graders. So like at Harrison Park, we just this next week are adding another first grade teacher. So I think that there's some areas where we're definitely seeing less enrollment. Like in my building, our 4th and 5th grade numbers are lower, but first grade is pretty high. 2nd grade is pretty high. And it's in the upper grades where we're seeing less students.
Thank you, Leah.
Now, I would just add, Karina, that we are seeing that at other schools also. Kelly comes to mind in particular. They had 6 students enroll in one day just last week. So we're seeing very similar patterns other places in the Southeast specifically.
But I'm going to call it a similar small rebound. How about that?
So I don't actually know exact numbers, but it does feel as though with my kids are at Mount Tabor in the JDLI, and there has definitely been retention issues due to CDL and learning a language online. And I know that there was something about that if you decided to not go back to school this fall in the DLI, that you could not return. So you could not continue online. Yeah.
And I'll concur with that. We have seen our greatest loss of numbers in our DLI programs to online learning, and I'll attribute a lot of that to many of my students that are in our DLI program are Chinese, and fear of the pandemic and Asian hate, those types of things, I think have really pushed a lot of those families to feel safer right now in online learning. So that's a huge group of our students we've lost.
I've had similar at Creative Science. We had quite a few kids want to move to the OLA or online learning options, or we even have families in pods that are choosing to homeschool and have withdrawn until vaccinations come out. So when you look at our numbers, we originally started with 428, And then we ended up at 468 by using our wait list. But then we were told the same thing at the beginning, that they would lose their spots. But we're told that that policy is now changed. So we filled spots from the wait list, and we're now being told that the OLA students do have the right to come back and have to hold their spots. So when and if that does return, that could cause a potential change there. And I've also been told specifically in our community, just as part of Southeast Guiding Coalition, that there are a lot of rumors in the Southeast that creative science is being closed or moving. And that is a deterrent for families applying and going into the lottery. I just think with the lack of the scenarios being out there, there's a lot of kind of innuendo and rumor right now about the future of the school, which is impacting enrollment right now until people get a sense of what's going to happen to the school.
Thank you, Chrissy.
I'm struck by the Kellogg number. I mean, I know Jed said, because I know Jed said that it actually, the new school effect had materialized, but if I'm reading this right, I mean, they're at like over 90% in their potentially dampened state, which is pretty high. So I'd love, as we go along, I'd be really curious to hear just how, I mean, I know that was a point of concern in phase one that the coalition had, right? About sort of how much is too much at Kellogg. And so I hope we can get a sense of that, from on the ground.
I can add one thing that we've seen. We've actually added at Harrison Park probably about 6 or 7 students that were slated to go to Kellogg, Bridger students that opted to come back to Harrison Park. For whatever reason, I didn't ask why. I just said, okay. But it's interesting.
That strikes me as a really tough task for a new school to open over 90% in a pandemic. So anyway, so there's a short-term question and there's a long-term question about how, depending on some, how we approach some of this stuff, whether we think that's an issue that needs to be addressed, that we need to try to address again. We tried in phase one and didn't really do it.
Chris.
I talked to just anecdotally, 3 families in the last couple of weeks who had children at Arleta and had the option of sending them to Lane or Kellogg. 2 white families and 1 BIPOC family, and all 3 of them chose to go to Kellogg. So,
And I would say just in general, I mean, about how this shapes thinking about, I mean, there's just so much uncertainty here, right? Like there was already some uncertainty, especially as we looked out at the, pegging scenarios to the pretty significant forecasted declines in outer Southeast enrollment over the next 5 years or so, and how much we trust that. And now you've added the sort of other layer of uncertainty, right? With the effects of COVID and when or if that's going to rebound. So it's probably not a helpful observation, but I think it makes the task here that much tougher. It's like, what set of assumptions do we feel confident making when there's a real short-term disruption, but we're trying to plan for the long term?
Anybody else? We haven't heard. Yeah, Sandra, we haven't heard from you.
So I'm an Arleta parent, and obviously we are far below the expected enrollment. I think it was minus 23.8%. For some reason, I cannot get to Jed's numbers, but I'm trying in my mind as far as how it shapes my thinking about enrollment programming balancing, trying to sort of reconcile that number with a projected number, and then also with the fact that our school is identified as one of the schools for future forecasting is bucking the trend and actually increasing in enrollment over the next several years. I think we in Marysville and another school were identified as schools doing that. So, I mean, personally, I only anecdotally know really like about how students are impacted at our school by our enrollment issue, of minus 23.8% or whatever it was. I mean, we've lost quite a few of our highly involved, better off families to online learning. I've noticed. I wish we had data about what our school demographics look like now compared to what they look like before the pandemic, because I would love to really see where that 20, that those people that were supposed to be there and aren't are. But just what I'm hearing is what I'm asking about, so and so and so and so and so and so. Oh well, they're homeschooling, they're pod schooling. Like I'm hearing a lot of that as well. I think someone else had mentioned that. Or 18%. Well, I got it way up there, Jed. Sorry.
Still 64 students, that's quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Elizabeth? Have we heard from you? What are your thoughts on this?
I don't. I think the data for me at this point is really preliminary for me to feel really comfortable saying anything definitive, or I would love to see it disaggregated by ethnicity and race. This is a really good conversation that kind of qualitatively describes people's experiences. I don't go to my kids' school because we're discouraged to, and they're old enough, I don't need to. And we're discouraged to for good reasons, right? They just don't need more people hanging about. So,
Right.
Yeah, it was but I think I just need more information about who we're talking about and what the attributions of the numbers mean, because I'm super uncomfortable drawing conclusions. And Jed, to your point, I don't know how we describe, like, I assume that Mount Tabor is one of the wealthier schools just because look at where they are. But it would be helpful if you could maybe key those schools. I mean, there are pros and cons to it, right? But when you make a reference to wealthier schools, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know which ones are considered that, and I don't know what the defining line is.
Yeah, Elizabeth, and just to that, it's completely relative based on what we're looking at here. So I'm just looking at the ones that are on either end of the direct certification. But to hear that, I'm just like, oh, which ones are you talking about?
Right. To have that relative to one, the SES, which is their socioeconomic status,
Exactly,
relative to one another in the data. Paulina, is there anything that you want to share with us? Anything about these numbers?
I was wondering the same, the disaggregated data. I would like to say ethnicity and race to see how the impact is in that community, those communities. Yeah, and also curious about families who have kids with disabilities in this data and this conversation, and also parents. I don't know if there are parents here who have kids with disabilities. I would love to see them included. Also considering that we have many families who are from different races, different ethnicities, and have kids with disabilities. I'm not a parent here in PPS. I work with families. I work in the special education department, and I talk to families every day. I speak Spanish, and I talk to families who speak Spanish, and I'm wondering where they are and how their input is gathered. I have an accent. I haven't heard in any of these meetings someone with an accent or someone who used an interpretation even. So if we are talking about a lot of different communities, where are those communities represented here? So we're talking about the data, we're talking about issues that are happening or things that are dealing with barriers, and I don't see anyone who can say, well, this is my experience. So yeah, I don't know, I have a lot of questions regarding that.
Yeah, I will say that in all of the sessions that we held for listening and learning, we offered, we tried to intentionally create them around languages, and the only folks that really required that were in the dual language conversations. So mostly Mandarin and Cantonese. So yeah, I did not see a great number of, because I even held a Spanish only session and we did not get good numbers. Yeah. Michelle, have we heard from you?
No, you haven't.
Is there anything you want to share?
I'm still thinking about the numbers. This is the second phase, and I've been through the first phase. So I just want to sit and sort of listen for a little bit longer. I'm not sure about the numbers yet, so, or anything.
What about Hassan? Is there anything you want to share? If you're trying to share, Hassan, you're on mute. All right, so going back to, we don't have much time left, but we talked a lot about the data itself, but is there any, does any of this shape your thinking in a different way about enrollment and program balancing? Or is there too little data with too little information, meaning without this disaggregation of both SES, race and ethnicity, families facing disabilities? Like, will having that help you shape your recommendations more?
I would say yes. I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead, Maya.
I was just going to say, I mean, I've been hesitating to kind of say anything because I'm late to this process. Last meeting was the first meeting I'd attended. So I'm feeling like I'm playing catch up in terms of just all of the data. But really what keeps I keep writing down here is that there doesn't really seem to be enough information. So I'm kind of confused as to how a decision is supposed to be made about anything. Like, and I'm in a unique situation. I'm at a school that, based on like direct certification, is considered probably a more affluent school, but I'm not in that category. Like I qualify for assistance. So it's like, it's an interesting perspective of having, like, being in a school that doesn't have actually a lot of diversity except for the DLI, and doesn't probably need as much help, but I'm a student. I mean, my student is benefiting from that. Sure. because if we went to our neighborhood school, that wouldn't be available. So I don't know. I'm a little bit overwhelmed by the lack of information, but then also feeling like there's a lot of acronyms and like language within this process that is confusing. So if it's confusing me, a parent volunteer, I have 4 children that are at 3 different schools in PPS, and I'm totally confused. I can't imagine that like a listening and learning session would be, that people are going to want to speak up or share their experiences.
And just what we asked in listening and learning was not at all about data, not at all about even enrollment. It was literally just what do your children need to be successful? What do you do you feel welcome? So the conversations we were having were, yet at least at this point, we're not quantitative, but I think you bring up a good point that there's a lot of language, a lot of acronyms that need explaining. And so, do we create almost a glossary of terms, if you will, not just for the SEGC, but for the community that then is impacted, is supposed to understand the work of the SEGC. So that's a good point, Maya.
I think what we're missing, I think this data is good. I think that as far as enrollment data goes, and I agree there's things we need to do to make it more accessible both to the, sorry, we're running out of time, but the point I was gonna make was, I think what's missing, and I've been a broken record about this since phase 1, and I know PPS is committed to it in phase 2, is we need to pair this with we need to hear from the instructional experts at PPS on like, what do these conditions that we're seeing in the numbers actually mean for the opportunities that kids do or don't have. I think that's what you don't get from these numbers, that I have some guesses about, but I'd love to hear from the instructional side of the house, basically.
That's a good point. Thanks, Andy.
I would just add that as someone who's super peripherally involved, just kind of watching what happened the first time around, I don't really have any context for phase one. And it's referenced a lot. And it just increases kind of the opaque feeling of the process, because I don't know what those references are signify.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. People that have joined this process. Okay, I think they're sending us back. So thank you so much for your input, and we'll process it back there.